So in this section, we're going to be doing more proofs, more geometry proofs, and we're going to be proving angle pair relationships. So here is our first theorem of this lesson, and it's called the right angle congruence theorem. You need to know this, okay? And what the right angle congruence theorem states is that all right angles are congruent. So you need to know this. Now, this actually has a name, so if you were to ever use this in your proof, you can just list the name, which is right angle congruence theorem. Now, if you blank out and you forget this name, you could just put as your reason that all right angles are congruent, which is almost the same as calling that long name. So just know that all right angles are congruent. What we're going to do is walk through the proof of this theorem. Once we prove it one time, now you can use that theorem as a reason, and you wouldn't have to do all these steps in your proof. So again, my first statement is what is given to me. Now, my goal here is to make sure that everything flows logically. So now, my next statement, because they told me that was given to me that angle 1 and angle 2 are right angles, now I'm stating what a right angle is. That the measure of angle 1 equals 90 and the measure of angle 2 equals 90. And this reason is definition of right angles. So I'm defining what it is, and a right angle has a measure of 90 degrees. My next step, notice I am going to now substitute because I know that both of them equal 90, so now I can set them equal to each other, and my reason here is substitution. And then, yes, all right. And then the last step, so if this were written like this, if it was 90 equals measure of angle 2, the 90s would have canceled, and you could have also said transitive here. Transitive would have also worked. All right, then the last step, again, if you wanted to see that, okay, if you already saw that this was going to happen, that you had to show that angle 1 was congruent to angle 2, you could have just gone right to that and just said that they were congruent. So this reasoning, going from an equal sign to a congruence, you're just putting definition of congruent angles. So if this were a test question, that would be your reason. Because again, I'm providing the statements. So when it goes from the same numbers, like angle 1 and angle 2, and it changes from an equal sign to a congruence, you would just put that it's the definition of congruent angles. If those were segments, it would be definition of congruent segments. So now that we've proven this theorem, now if I were to give you a problem, and let's say, again, the same given, that 1 and 2 are right angles. Now if I wanted to prove this, I could just put step 1, let me do it in a darker color here. Step 1, I would put angle 1 and angle 2 are right angles. And my reason would be given. And then step number 2, I could go right to angle 1 is congruent to angle 2. And then my reason would be right angles congruency theorem, because all right angles are congruent. So now that I've taught you this theorem, you don't need to go through this whole process. You can prove this problem right here in 2 steps by stating the given and then stating the theorem. Next one, this is called the congruent supplements theorem. And what this states is if 2 angles are supplements to the same angle, or 2 congruent angles, then they are congruent. So what this is saying, that if 1 and 2 are supplements, or supplementary, and 3 and 2 are supplementary, then 1 is congruent to 3. So notice they are both congruent, or not, both supplements to angle 2. So because they're congruent, since they're both supplements to the same angle, then that would mean that those two angles are congruent. So angle 1 and angle 3 would be congruent angles because they're both supplements with angle 2. Next one, let's go through it. So this is how you might be given a question on your test. Notice I've provided all the statements. You have to come up with all the reasons. So my first reason here, you can see that it was given to me right here. Here, we can see that they're telling me that the measure of angle 1 plus the measure of angle 2 equals 180, and then the measure of angle 3 plus the measure of angle 2 equals 180. And when we're showing what the two angles add up to be, this is our definition of supplementary angles. Because remember, the definition stated that you have two angles, that their sum is 180 degrees. So this reason is definition of supplementary angles. Now, notice in step 2, both of those equal 180. So if they both equal 180, my next step could be substitution. I can't do transitive here because it's got two things that it's equal to. It's usually one thing equals something. And then now my next reason from step 3 to 4, notice they subtracted the same angle from both sides. So this would be subtraction property of equality. Again, make sure you're spelling out subtraction and substitution so I know what you're talking about. And then notice just from 4 to 5, all they did was change that equal sign to a congruence. So this would be definition of congruent angles. So just like we have the theorem for supplements, now we have the congruent complements theorem. And it's the same thing, but just know that the two angle pairs are going to be complements. They'll add to 90. So if two angles are complements to the same angle or to congruent angles, then they are congruent. So it's stating here that if 1 and 2 are complementary and 3 and 2 are complementary, then angle 1 is congruent to angle 3. So they're both complements to angle 2. So then that would tell me that angle 1 and angle 3 are congruent. So for example, if I put numbers in here, let's say angle 1 was 40 and angle 2 was 50. Notice that those are complements. So then if I also tell you that these two are complements, then I can already see that this one also has to be 40. Because again, they need to add to 90. So if they're complement to the same angle, then those two angles are congruent. Next one is called the linear pair postulate. Now really we've already seen this. It's just stating here, if two angles form a linear pair, then they are supplementary. So now if we use this in a reason and a proof, we can just put that we're using the linear pair postulate. So again, angle 1 and angle 2, they're forming a linear pair, so they are supplementary. Next, we're going to see vertical angles. Next is the vertical angles definition. So here the definition states, two angles such that the sides of one angle are opposite rays to the sides of the other. So we already learned this, but now we're seeing it officially, and we can use this as a reason in our proof. So when they're talking about how the angles are created, it's the definition of vertical angles. So again, if I were to extend the sides of angle 2, that makes angle 4, which is vertical to 2. That's vertical angles. So 1 and 3 are vertical, and 2 and 4 are vertical. The next slide has the vertical angles theorem. So make sure you keep track of what's the definition and what's the theorem. The definition tells you how they're made, and the theorem talks about that they're congruent. So the theorem states that vertical angles are congruent. The definition describes how the vertical angles are made. So when you have two vertical angles, their measures are going to be the same. They are congruent angles. So here, 1 would be congruent to 3, 2 would be congruent to 4. Vertical angles are congruent. And now we're going to prove that vertical angle theorem. So again, our first statement is going to be our given, because they told us that 5 and 7 are vertical angles. Then for number 2, they're stating that 5 and 6 are a linear pair, and so are 6 and 7. So this is actually going to be, they're describing it, definition of a linear pair. For step 3, 5 and 6 are supplementary, and this would be our linear pair postulate. Remember, the postulate states that when you have a linear pair, they're supplementary. And then the last statement, we're going to use that congruent supplement theorem. So our congruent supplement theorem, and I'm abbreviating the word congruent with that symbol. So this would be congruent supplements theorem. So if they're both supplements to the same angle, notice they're both supplements to 6. That's why I can show that 5 is congruent to 7, because they're congruent to the same angle. The last slide says to classify each statement as true or false. So if the measure of angle A plus the measure of angle B plus the measure of angle C equal 180, then A, B, and C are supplementary. True or false? It is false. It has to be a pair of angles. We've got 3 here. So this is false. This was a trick question. Yes, supplementary angles add to 180, but it's always only 2. It's a pair of angles. Okay, next one. Vertical angles have the same measure. That is true. That is your vertical angles theorem. Okay, and then the last one. If angle 1 and angle 2 are vertical angles, and the measure of angle 1 equals 2x plus 8, and the measure of angle 2 equals 3x plus 4, then x equals 14. What do we need to do to confirm that x equals 14?
They equal each other.
Good. We're going to set them equal to each other, because remember, vertical angles are congruent. So I will set these two equal to each other. See if when I solve this, if I do get x equals 14. So let's go ahead and do this. I'm going to change colors so you can see it. 8 equals x plus 4. Move the 4. Does x equal 14? No, it equals 4. So this would be false, because x equals 4. So this would be an application of that vertical angles theorem, and you need to know that vertical angles are congruent. So your homework is, you have homework for 2-7, and you also have the chapter review. So you do have to turn in both assignments. There is also an additional review, and it's not graded because I provided the answers for you. This chapter has a lot of information, a lot of definitions, postulates, laws, a whole lot of stuff, plus your first taste of proofs here. So I highly recommend you spend the weekend studying. I'm also going to put up a few more study guides up for you guys to use also. I feel the more information you have, the better off you're going to be. And then on Monday, we'll go over all of this. So when you come in, you should be doing the warm-up, and then we're going to go over all of this homework and get you ready for Tuesday's test. That's it.